the headline of this plenary is Citizens, Science and Democracy, and where does that title come from? Well, it's inspired by several things. First, the recent development of a European Citizen Science Association taking off, actually having also a launching meeting yesterday. And through that also thinking about, well, there are different approaches to deal with citizen science and democracy. Then I read a small piece where Alan Irving, who is also on the panel, said that he may make a new edition of his book, Citizen Science, from the mid-90s. So we also had Alan actually at our first Living Knowledge conference, so it was obvious to have Alan also talking on this panel. It's even cheaper than last time because now he's based in Copenhagen.
Cheap is good.
Not much CO2 coming from bringing him here. And then we will also have the presentations from European Environmental Agency. That's one of the agencies working with the interaction between citizens and science in relation to environment. And finally, we also have a presentation where Martin has been looking into, well, when we talk participation in research project, what participation is it actually that is going on? Who is participating and what is the impact of this? So we have these, as you can see here, 4 persons in the panel, and there's also in the book of abstract a short piece from each of them. You will, however, outside the name of, you will not find Chris's name in the book of abstract, but David Stanners, who is another one from the European Environmental Agency, but David had to leave one day earlier for a conference in Helsinki, so his colleague Chris took over. So we'll run it the way that each of the speakers will have 10-15 minutes. We'll have a question or two between each of the presentations, and then some discussion towards the end. So first I'll give the floor to Alan, who is today Professor and Dean of Research at Copenhagen Business School, and Alan will talk about public engagement with science, whether we have moved from deficit to democracy or we are moving maybe back again. So welcome, Alan.
Thank you very much. I may not be interesting, but I am cheap. I want you to just bear that in mind if you feel a little critical as I'm speaking. But I also feel very much that I should be listening to you. I don't think that anything I can say will be more interesting than your own experiences. So I hope we have the chance to have some dialogue and some discussion around some of the issues that I speak about, knowing that many other people in the room, I'd say just about everyone else in the room, has probably thought about these issues already. And before I say that, I just want to say again, thank you to the team behind this meeting, thank you to the department, to Christian and colleagues from Aalborg, thank you to the Living Knowledge Conference. This has come, we have come a long way since Leuven all those years ago. It's just fantastic to see a group of people like this together in one place and to feel that an idea that some people said, well, that was a very 70s idea, wasn't it? Going to die in the 1980s. In 2014 is stronger and more vibrant than ever. So huge congratulations to everyone who's played a part in that. I speak as a social scientist, but someone with a long fascination, obsession, you might say, with the relationship between science, citizens, and democracy. And as Mikhail was kind enough to mention the book I did back in 1995, there are no plans for a second edition at all. No publishers actually approached me, but I think if I keep talking about it, someone's going to give me a really big book contract to do it, and I can promptly retire. But when I did that back in 1995, I remember one of my colleagues, actually one of my kind of colleagues, I'll just call him Peter. I know exactly who he is and where he lives, but I'll be kind and just call him Peter. And he said, well, you know, that's an okay book. He was being very nice to me, as you can hear. But I guess you really don't have any idea about how to put that into practice. Because in 1995, there was already, and I'm not trying to offend anyone in this room, a huge amount of experience from many countries, not least the Netherlands, Denmark, I have to say, very inspired. It's in the book by Belfast in the science shop that was being established over there. I just want to say to Eileen, the umbrella from the Living Knowledge Conference you gave out is actually falling apart now. There's some kind of guarantee on those umbrellas. It's only lasted 5 years, and it was free. But at that point, I mean, he correctly diagnosed that there was a shortage of cases. I mean, look at this now. Who could possibly argue that there's a shortage of cases nearly 20 years later? And one thing which has stayed with me all of that time through this preoccupation has been a criticism of the idea that all it takes is for people to have a better technical understanding. All it takes is for people to understand science in order to just simply accept one version of scientific progress. That it's just a question of people soaking up knowledge. I was at a meeting, I'll just say, in Sweden a few weeks ago, and the theme was very important, very interesting, about aging and healthy aging. And someone, actually not just one person, but several people were saying in that meeting that when it comes to older people, the problem is that they just don't accept new science and technology. If we can only get these people to use the technology that's available, there really shouldn't be any difficulty whatsoever. And every time I hear that, steam comes out of my ears. And I just think, well, would it be so complicated? Would it be so impossible for you clever people just to go and ask people, you know, what is it that you need? What is it that would be helpful? How do you improve the quality of your life rather than having the arrogance? Because basically that's what it is. To assume that you have the answers and it's just a problem of public resistance. That was called a long time ago the deficit model, the deficit criticism. And the title that again Mikhail referred to of a recent very short paper about the deficit model was precisely saying that any idea that that was killed off in the 1990s is obviously absurd. It's impossible to get into any discussion about science, technology, and innovation without someone raising this kind of idea that it's just, we have all the answers, we have all the solutions. It's just to get the question of getting people to accept those solutions. Why are they so damn difficult? So basically, my basic argument is that there are choices when it comes to the direction of change. I think many of you hopefully will agree. The technical knowledge alone doesn't provide all the answers. In fact, we often seem to start as if that's the key problem, and perhaps we ought to turn that around a little bit. But of course, that doesn't in any way undermine or take away the significance of technical knowledge, because people then often get rather defensive. In many ways, it makes it much more interesting to see how can we work in a way which perhaps starts with society and brings in science and technology, rather than doing it as so often the other way around. Now, it seems to me that when large discussions about science, technology, and innovation take place, they often occur at a very grand level. And I'm part of that as well. I'm part of a group recently which did a public engagement exercise on global food security. So the research programs in the UK get together and decide that it's sensible to coordinate around the global food security issue, which sounds reasonable enough. So we have some kind of engagement exercise to find out what people think about global food security. But guess what? They don't walk around with any idea of global food security in their head at all. So you're starting the debate from a position which might make lots of sense to the institutions, because there is a thing called the Global Food Security Program. I'm part of it. But of course, you're coming with issues and questions and problems which are entirely unfamiliar. And then what happens, and I think I compared this previously to the sort of feeling that school teachers have when they're setting an exam for kids and they know damn well that those kids are not prepared and are probably going to underperform. That's how many people behind engagement exercises think. Of course, yet again, the public disappoint because they talk about terrorism. They talk about international security, not about global food security. And everyone gets very frustrated by that formulation. But perhaps it's more interesting than talking about it as if the public are a problem or we know what the issues are, to say, well, let's look at the everyday context in which people work. And that's where I think your experience in this room is so very powerful. It was very, very important to me back in the 1970s and 80s that, well, actually a close member of my family was working in the asbestos industry in the northwest of England. Actually, my brother was working in Rochdale in an asbestos company. And we had many, many discussions, not just with my brother, but also with many of his friends and colleagues from the company, about the relationship between asbestos and health. But you know, as soon as you turn from what's about the future of global food security or the future of nanotechnology and say, you know, will working in this industry give me cancer? And if it will give me cancer, shall I stop my job? Shall I just stop working? The whole thing changes. The whole thing changes because science and technology, of course, is extremely important in terms of dealing with that very real issue, in terms of the links between asbestos and health. But quickly, and now we're just sitting in the pub, you know, this isn't some scientific conference setting, we're just sitting in the pub talking about it, you know, what do we know about the link between asbestos and cancer? What's the basis of the knowledge? And you start to talk about the different kind of evidence that exists. Quickly you get into the question of what are the limitations of that knowledge. Because of course we know the best scientific knowledge in the world can't tell an individual person in an individual situation. But guess what? That's what's important to them. They are that individual in that particular situation. You quickly find it's impossible to separate the technical aspects of this from the living knowledge, from the living context of that situation, because this is also about jobs, it's also about choices that people have in their everyday life. And as one person said in a different public engagement group I was involved with, who's the best person to answer those questions? And I remember very well someone saying in the group, is that a scientist or a rabbi? You know, which is the scientist or the rabbi who knows best about those things? So as soon as you look at that, the whole picture, and I'm sure most of you in the room have been there, the whole picture changes. It's not about knowledge over here and society over there. It's not about, you know, who's right or who's wrong. It's how to make sense of these very specific, very loaded situations. And I, for one, sitting in the pub in Rochdale, was very aware that I didn't have the answers. I knew I couldn't just walk away from helping find the answers, but I knew that not one of us has the answer at all. Who's there to help in that kind of situation? Who is there to help? Well, my answer is that you're here to help. That's what the people in this room, for me, and you can react to that in any way you like, that to me is an important inspiration behind the whole idea of living knowledge. It's one thing to discuss those questions in the context of a university. It's another thing when you enter into those loaded situations. And don't get me wrong, it's also important to talk about nanotechnology or synthetic biology. It's also important to have those large debates. But for me, if we can't do something for the person in that situation, in all humility, in knowing that of course we don't have the answers either, but in some way to enter into a partnership or some sort of mutual commitment which will help find those answers, then we're missing something very important. So I want to say that for me, citizen science, the idea which I notice has come into more interest, I was going to say fashion, but that sounds pejorative, I don't mean to be pejorative. It's become a term that's been more in currency, let's say, recently. For me, citizen science is about that relationship. It's not about a different knowledge type. It's about working in context. It's about recognizing that there are different knowledges, but that knowledge in itself won't be sufficient. So I'll finish now by saying neither knowledge nor our sense of democracy can stand still. It's about living knowledge, but it's also about living democracy. I think it's important always to keep an eye on the critical issues, pessimism of the intellect, but I think it's also important to take some inspiration from the activities which have happened, not least over the last 30 years or so, and have some real optimism of the will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Is there a question for Alan? So how do you work yourself today, Alan, with citizen science, being a dean at a business school?
Okay, that's an inside question. Well, one thing, I could say a lot about that. It sounds strange to be in a business school, but I think one thing which you can do in a business school is be very cross-disciplinary. I think part of it is that you can work across borders very easily. I think another part of it, and that's one last thing about being in Scandinavia, Denmark, I have to say, has got a long history of activities in this area, is to say, well, we can take issues like corporate social responsibility, which in a way, tackle these kind of questions from a very different sort of direction. And it was one of the things of what you said, Mikhail, but also came up in Christian's presentation, we can take an area like innovation, and it's an old argument, but perhaps these things didn't flow together previously. I don't think 20 years ago I would have talked at all about innovation. Even though I was very aware of parallel discussions, very important parallel discussions going on, and say, can we not bring those things together in some sort of way? So I suppose the older I get, the more I think that it's important to find partial solutions, you know, to work in context, real situations. That's the advantage of being in a business school, and say, well, what can we do best in this situation? And hopefully that will create some larger inspiration. This has happened exactly in this area, starting, I guess, with people in the 70s, perhaps it was the Netherlands, especially. A lot of people from those very small scale examples have taken a huge amount of inspiration. Okay, yeah.
How do you keep governance, with capital G, in contact with loaded situations? Perhaps from your own personal experience and on the general.
When you say governance with a capital G?
Like dean levels,
Oh.
also in politics, like
Yes.
decision makers.
Yes.
So how can we bridge, how can we bring people to take decisions that affect quite a lot of people, and how can we bring loaded experience to them?
How do you mix governance with these sort of issues? I think what I would really want to stress, and now I'm kind of shifting into a discussion about being a university senior manager, is what I am. It's important for people to take those positions. It's very important that people step forward and take that level of responsibility, even though it leaves you horribly exposed in all kinds of ways. I mean, and I know this because every PhD student of mine always loves to tease me about, ha, you talk about democracy, you don't call that democratic. So you have to kind of, and of course they'll be right, because sometimes you just need to do things. But I think it's really important that people step forward and take, that's my feeling anyway, and take that level of responsibility. And then something interesting happens when you're doing that, because governance with a big G, I think I know what you mean, the big concepts, often seem to go into the background somehow. So you're often reduced to saying, what's the best you can do in this situation? And how, I guess the test I apply is, how would I be able to explain this to someone afterwards? How could I justify it? What would I think if I was looking at it from the outside? So often it's an old thing, but the people who perhaps have got talent in that area often step back because they feel someone else ought to do that, and it's a little bit intimidating. I don't claim any talent whatsoever in that area, but somehow I think it is important to be there and to do your best while you can. Not forever, but for a few years, to try your best in that situation. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Oops, now we are.
Sorry, don't take
Take
much time.
one question more then.
Sir, you expressed some appropriate disquiet about security discourse as perhaps deriving from anti-terrorist, larger global anxieties that are managed in particular ways and have very uneven impacts. I wonder if there's any merit to the suggestion that when one uses the expression food security, that it should always be attended by the notion of food sovereignty, because that sovereignty is always located in the local and empowers the local in order to engage in interaction with the overarching discourse.
Yeah, but I think that's right. And the point I was trying to draw attention to is often the people who are framing the consultation or the exercise have got one quite clear idea in mind. And to go back to the previous question, I have a certain sympathy with the people behind those exercises. I mean, they're good people. You know, they actually want. I really believe this. It doesn't help if you just say, well, they're all in league with the Monsanto. I think they're sincerely trying. But of course, in order to make the exercise worthwhile from their point of view, they delimit it in ways, and you can sort of see how that happens in the system. But the challenge is always to listen, you know, to hear back to what people are saying, and not to say, hey, that's off the issue. Why are they talking about terrorism when the issue is global food? But say, well, actually, you know, isn't that interesting that people are connecting the global food issue with this issue of well, not security in the military sense, but a sense of living in an insecure world. And a lot of ethical issues start to come out. So it's how to listen to this and not push it to the margins because that's not relevant. I think that's a big challenge in these exercises. But I take your point, that's all.
Okay, thank you. So we will now move on to Patrick Roland, who is the coordinator, I think it is, of the recently established European Citizen Science Association. So one of those new concepts, or maybe old concepts that have got new energy during the recent years. So that's why we have asked Catherine to come and say something about citizen science and what it is. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here to this, you said you call it a party, to this living knowledge party. And in fact, you see, I just omitted the comma of the name of the session and called it Citizen Science and Democracy, Benefits and Challenges. Okay, I think we all share this main assumption that scientific literacy increases civic participation in decision making. And I think we also reflected there's some underlying assumption, at least for Western countries, that science shapes modern life. We cannot escape science because we find it in nearly every aspect of our daily life, of what we are doing, how we move, how we communicate, everything. Always you find science in the results of scientific research. And but also some connections, scientific connections, which are a bit more difficult to understand. In fact, to understand the relationship between these two figures is atmospheric chemistry. Of course, if you go back to all these processes, we have different lifestyles, consumption styles, then we have the IPCC developed S3 scenarios based on different assumptions about trade and development. Then we have all this climate community developing global change models or global circulation models, which can only be understood if you have some idea of greenhouse gases, and then you come to assign all these anthropogenic changes to our climate system, transport of energy, and all these things. And then you come to the droughts and in Africa, and even you can't assign one specific weather event to climate change. So there are a lot of very complicated things. And now the challenge is how to integrate citizen scientists in all these different and complex issues. So it's not always as easy as you perhaps may think. Also, I think we see there are a lot of advantages and benefits of citizen science. We already learned about it. If we have citizen science project, we have joint learning and understanding. We have also ownership. A lot of projects start with some kind of conscious building, that people are asked to observe a bit better the environment. There are, for example, interesting projects with regard to air pollution. And if people start to really observe air pollution or noise or light pollution or anything, then of course ownership increases and also the responsibility for the direct environment. So participation and engagement is increasing. So there's certainly very interesting benefits of citizen science, and there's also this democratization of knowledge, so that the access to knowledge is increasing, and that of course increases participation of the broader society. So what is citizen science? Can we frame it? And you already mentioned yesterday we had the meeting of first General Assembly of the emerging Citizen Science Association, and there's one working group which is chaired by Lucy Robinson, and we started not to develop really a definition, but rather some principles. What is citizen science and how to perform the citizen science projects. And you can learn more if you go to our webpage, but I would like to introduce you to the very first two principles. One is that citizen science projects involve citizens who are actively involved. So that is very important, that there's some consciousness. It's not enough that the data, if you go to the supermarket, are cached, or if you have some phone calls or something like that. But our idea from the EXA community of citizen science is that the citizens really actively participate in the different projects. And it is also a scientific approach. So citizen science projects should have a genuine scientific question or goal. So not every engagement is, according to our understanding, citizen science. And perhaps to give you some examples of citizen science projects. For example, already before citizen science, this name came off. There's a long tradition of the so-called learned associations, where lay people and experts are working together, for example, in the building communities. And in fact, if you're going a bit more back to history, this job description scientist is rather new. It's perhaps 200 years old or so. So it's our current understanding of scientists, but it's also quite a modern concept. So there's a long tradition that persons are working together for different questions. For example, with regard to monitoring programs, they are sometimes very sophisticated, and the data can be used and made publicly available, and they really can be used to say something about the climate change, for example. Or there are other projects, for example, butterflies, butterfly monitoring. You really can say something about how land use impacts the appearance of butterflies. The butterflies are going down because we have this intensive landscape. So things like that can be concluded if you really have a very sophisticated monitoring framework. So there are nice examples, and I think the most known example is the one from Great Britain, which is also taken as an example if you're developing new projects. It's the OPAL project, Open Air Laboratories, and they also started with this increasing or supporting this interest in nature, and they combine it very, that's very nicely combined also with education things. But you learn also from this project that you really need resources for your communication and for your stuff. So without resources, you're not able to support and to run citizen science projects. So if you now come and look for some, I will call it some ideal scientific process, it starts with a research question. You have an idea or a scientific question, then you go out and you collect your data, you interpret your data, you communicate your data, and perhaps you implement them, and there also should be some kind of evaluation phase and some feedback. So that's some kind of idea how you make a research project. And if you come to the contribution of citizen scientists, you mainly find them in the area of data and collection. There are only a few examples so far where citizen scientists already contribute to the development of the question or also contribute to the interpretation of data. There are some examples, and there are many examples from the United States, but I think in Europe, and this is something we are working on also within the EXA community. But there can be some traps. So also developing a research question. Scientific root less in society is the scientific system itself. It may become more open, but how we can maintain also the reliability of research and also the creativity. It's not always the majority who's having the brilliant ideas, or sometimes very small groups which are quite outside the system. So how can we maintain this creativity if we say democracy is the majority? And also we should talk about the distribution of resources. There are already some fears of bigger research institutes that now every citizen can decide upon the topics of research, and also how we are going to evaluate citizen science projects. How can we evaluate impact of projects? So with the citizen science, it's interesting, but a lot of questions are arising, and I'm looking forward to this conference to discuss them in a bit more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. Are there some questions? Yeah.
Yes, hello. I come from the US, where we have one of those programs that you might have been referring to in terms of citizens or residents, not everybody's a citizen, is involved in every stage of the process, from defining the problem to interpreting and using the results and owning the knowledge. The question I have, in our case, is water quality monitoring of late in response to shale gas fracking. The question I have is, how do you maintain quality control sufficient for the results to be usable by this, actually have an impact on state decision making by the government, to actually meet the requirements that the state can make a regulatory decision on based on the data that have been collected and interpreted and presented by the public?
That's one of the questions. There are different methods to guarantee the quality of the data. For example, in the area of biodiversity research, you can have very educated person, you know the data or what they are providing is correct. So that's also the method the birders are doing. They have the certificates and know the persons who are providing the data. But of course, you also can have some back office within the database, some tests whether the data are reliable. But of course, it is all a question. But if there are some publications who compare the data provided by citizen scientists and others, and sometimes there is not really a difference with regard to quality, so that need not to be an argument. I think it's rather, the question is rather whether they really want to know to hear something about the impact of their policy.
Yeah, two questions. The lady in purple first, and then
Thank you. I am coming from Lincoln Business School in UK. I have one question about how do you engage with the research question, local knowledge, with bringing back the expectations, issues of local knowledge, and at the same time how you are helping them in a participatory evaluation from the beginning to identify impact in policy development, in local knowledge, in the relationship with decision-making processes. So it's how they are learning and how you are taking that from the beginning. Thank you.
I think that is one of the challenges we have. For example, we are now running a capacity building project to address these kind of questions, and the feedback and the high expectations of the local community is sometimes different to tackle, because not always, or my impression is that not all the projects I'm aware of really from the beginning think about the resources they really need for this feedback process, because you have to have persons and people who are able to talk with the local communities, and you have to have the resources to give the feedback and talk with the local community, what is happening with the results, where are they going to, why you can't proceed, and what you achieved, and how you answered the question. So for me, it's not totally resolved, and if anybody in the room can provide an example, I would be quite happy. So I think it's not totally resolved, to be honest.
Yes, Mark Lipinski from Paris. Before I ask my question to Catherine, I would like to go back to the previous question on whether citizen science data are reliable. First, as Catherine said, if you try to reproduce lots of science that's being published in the best journals, sometimes or often enough it's not very reproducible. That's one thing. The second thing is that one way to make citizen science data reliable is to repeat the observations. For instance, if you have thousands of people who make similar observations and they are repeatable, then they become reliable. Now my question to Catherine is, citizen participation in science has a very long tradition in natural sciences. So it's not really a surprise that it's becoming again very hot right now. The question is, how do you extend participation, citizen participation in the science making process to other fields with a similar success as in natural sciences?
I think one of the most promising areas is if you're going to, for example, for this evaluation processes. There are some projects, if you're going to evaluate, for example, ecosystem services, it's an idea to integrate more the views, expectations, also the living quality of the citizens to really frame the projects. And again, you need resources not to organize some deliberation processes. There may be online, there may be workshops or something like that, but I think it's impossible to do it without some kind of workshops and resources to really have this deliberation process. And perhaps one remark to the data, reputation is not everything. Sometimes you really need some specific design. For example, if you want to say some species is no longer occurring, you can't do anything with all these repetitions. You need really a monitoring design and also check species which are not there, so you need educated persons. So data quality is a big thing.
Well, yeah, one last question here, there with the dark purple, I think, or violet in the very back.
I'm Margriet Roos from the Netherlands, and I was wondering whether we shouldn't reframe citizen science, because we are all for inclusive approaches, but citizens, we are not everybody of us is unfortunately a citizen. There are many people worldwide who are stateless, where there are two or living in several nation states, where there are refugees in our countries. So, just to question it, whether we should go from citizens to people's science, or maybe even another better term.
Thank you for the question. I think citizens is also said in comparison to individuals, because citizens imply some kind of social responsibility. But of course, it's refugees are also citizens. I just doubt they have time to deal with this kind of questions, to be honest. But of course, citizens should be some kind of global approach of persons having some social responsibility. It's my personal opinion.
Thank you. I think we here got some interesting questions to discuss, and breaks and so on, and there will on Friday morning, 2 first sessions there. Now the other ones, there will be 2 full sessions of citizen science, where different citizen science projects will be presented and discussed, if you want to engage more in that field and talk with some of the participants. Now I'll invite Chris from European Environmental Agency. So what Chris will be talking about is not necessarily citizen science, maybe also citizen science, but as an agency that really works with citizen and science and policy, of course, citizens also play a role. So looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. Indeed, I will have a focus on the science policy, but also the knowledge policy interface, and how we, from a very practical approach, we engage with citizens. And then a strong focus, of course, on the European citizens. But before, I think I have to do a confession for Ellen. My background is technology. So it might help later in the debate that what you will see is taken from somebody who knows very little about social science, political science, or whatever. I'm coming from earth science background, but during my career over the last 30 years, I discovered the importance of the citizens. And that's what I will hope to reflect on how we think we are bridging the gap between this IT community, very often driven by a lot of other interests than what society at large should focus on. One slide about who we are. For those who know the European Environment Agency, we are one of those independent, decentralized EU bodies based here in Copenhagen. So as well, very easy for me it was to step in for David Stenners, who apologized not to be here. What we have to provide is objective, reliable, timely information for decision making. Decision making at local level, at European level, but also to the public. And for what, of course, it's clear that we try to achieve improvements from our environment with the target of moving towards a sustainable society. Now, if I look to how we engage with citizens so far, we can see two parallel developments, and I think it came already very clear from the previous talks. When also the European Environment Agency started, we had a strong focus on that citizens should have access to environmental information. And that over the last years changed dramatically to citizen participation in environmental information. And I think it's a very important observation that we encounter in our daily work. And that we had indeed to match with the rapid technological developments. So that is what I would say what we see as an important development over the last years, where as well we had a change from environmental information over the last 30, 40 years when Europe came forward with a lot of legislation about the environmental acquis. It was very often environmental information from experts for experts. That gradually moved into where we were moving from information from experts for citizens, but still in a very complicated shape, where it was not always easy for the citizen to understand what experts are talking about. So now we are moving much more into a facilitation role, where information from citizens is made for the citizens, and where experts are more and more becoming in a support role. So that is what we see happening over the last decades. And if we take then why are we now focusing more and more on the citizen aspects, that I think was very clear from previous presentations as well, from Professor Klaus and as well also the previous talks, is that within Europe we put forward now a clear vision 2050 towards sustainability, where we have now to be prepared with information that can handle this transition. And where in Europe we are quite well observed. We have the Vision 2050 set out in the 7th Environmental Action Plan, also at this global level, where we are now working on the Sustainable Development Goals. We have as well a number of policy instruments where we have clear targets set for 2020, 2030. As an environment agency, we work with 5-year work programs, so we have to see how we can address these challenges. And that's, if I take the 7th Environmental Action Plan, where 9 priorities are put forward, if you look to the priority objective 5, that is to improve the knowledge and evidence base for EU environment policy. And there we have a clear recognition of the importance of the citizen. So how do we have to change how we deal with access and sharing of environmental information within the European Union. You might as well be familiar, probably more familiar with the Horizon 2020 program now, so the 8th framework program from research, where they will continue to fund this kind of networking activities like we have here today. It's based on, as you probably know, on 3 pillars. The 3rd pillar will deal specifically with the societal challenges. And that's, I think, where we have to make sure that we put our marker in making best use of these huge investments that Europe will do during the coming years. From an EA perspective, so very briefly, but I think it's important also for what I will say next, is that we are structuring our work into 3 strategic areas. First of all, we need to secure that we continue to inform how policy is implemented in Europe. There's a lot of work to be done, there's a lot of monitoring being implemented by the countries. Monitoring of the environment is extremely expensive. Just to give you one example, on an annual basis to monitor air quality, where you have a number of stations in Europe, I think it's to maintain it's 800 million euro per year. So you can imagine what the investment is done on this authoritative environmental monitoring. What will be a game changer now is where we can make use of the citizen in the whole aspect as well of monitoring. So not only when it comes to the information provision, but as well as on the monitoring what is happening with the changes in our environment. And the second strategic area we need to tackle is all the systemic challenges. where we are lacking. We have a lot of gaps in knowledge, a lot of gaps in data, to make sure that we have the relevant underpinning knowledge base for the decision making. And then the third strategic area, which is very, I think, crucial, is where we as well took up what was mentioned as this buzzword of knowledge co-creation. So where we are fully convinced with our stakeholders that this is the way forward for the next 5 years. About the what do we need to address, so it's quite complex. So involvement with citizens, citizen engagement, citizen science will have to deal with not only biodiversity, but as well as with air pollution, transport, noise, industrial pollution, climate change mitigation, impact, vulnerability and adaptation, water management, the marine environment, which is as well also where we have enormous gaps and still a lot of discussions on what is the underpinning knowledge base available. Urban will become a hot topic where we have to see as well. We're knowing that by 2025, probably 80% of Europe's citizens will live in cities, so that's one of the key topic areas that we have to consider, as well as also the complexity of waste and material resources, where, of course, one of the priorities is, of course, that we need to, as well, move to a more resource-efficient society. Now, bear with me just a minute on how we organize this process, and I would like here to emphasize on the shift that we had over the past 20 years of the existence of the Environment Agency, where you could see that initially, most of our information products that we were making available were based on what we collected through the official sources from countries, so the member states, the member countries we have in our network, we have currently 33 participating countries, that gradually moved into more and more making use of research data, because the monitoring facilities that were put in place do not always give you the right answer to what is happening with current society. We were currently making a first rough estimate, and at this moment we moved from 20 years ago, where most of the information was based on this official monitoring, where now in the latest indicator report that we published is only 10%. So the rest is coming from a lot from research, as well as new technology, where Europe is now investing another 4 billion in putting a satellite infrastructure in place that will complement in situ monitoring, where as well we hope as well to fill in gaps to have more timely information available, more comparable information available. But probably what is for us where we have also a big improvement is how we make use of citizens, civil society and business as well. So business as well is becoming also one of the contributors of the knowledge base that we have to provide for decision making in Europe. It was already mentioned, we are talking about, when we talk about citizen engagement, there are multiple concepts and approaches. We heard about citizen science, we heard about crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is typically as well where when you can have a lot of repetition of the same observation, it gives you a kind of reliability. We have been talking as well about the participatory science was mentioned. What was not yet raised is the importance of lay local traditional knowledge, where I also can give you an example, and that's where I would like to end up with, to give you a kind of examples of how we are dealing with citizen engagement through a number of activities. From very well established, one of the, it was already mentioned on butterfly and bird counts. If you take in the agricultural policy, for instance, bird farmland indicators, which is purely based on citizen observations, is taken as a high-level policy relevant indicator every year, where decisions on how the cap reform biodiversity strategies are defined. I can give you a few examples of new developments. Recently we published in the end of last year a new report on bats. Thanks to citizen observation, we have there a very positive story to tell, 40% increase of bats population, still based on I think 8 or 9 countries, so it's not yet a full coverage. But there we see as well that where we did not have, or there was no information available, thanks to making use of citizen engagement, it can be local scientists, it can be as well a lot of communities, we end up in reliable policy relevant data. Marine Litter Watch is a different approach. There, European Environment Agency were now strongly engaged in collecting beach litter data. It's not that we as agency are collecting the data, but we work there with communities who are doing this kind of activities. And we are putting on top of that the necessary, what was mentioned already, what is needed to come to an information and data product that can be then taken up by decision makers for taking, putting in place right pieces of legislation as well. But we learn by doing. One of the exercises we set up was 5 years ago. It was called Iron Earth, where one of the main challenges we had was how can we set up a two-way communication with citizens. We tried out many things, starting initially from, okay, two-way communication, what does it mean? You open your communication channels, you ask for comments, text, they can send photos, but soon we figured out that, okay, but what do you do with this information? So we had to rethink, so we thought, okay, let's do it a bit more targeted, where we can put the official monitoring, in this case it was of air quality data, and we ask citizens to give their perception, their subjective appraisal, what they think about the air quality, and they can report it online, real time, by providing a little app, so that they can as well see in real time their observation combined with the authoritative data. Good progress was made, but there as well, it's quite complex. Then how do you do the interpretation of this information? We thought, let's try to bring in social media, where you can have a better interaction, making use of Facebook, of Twitter. The example that is given here about flooding, on how can we there as well make sure that the information flows where it should be. Sometimes with unexpected results. We launched Noise Watch, so where as well we have lack in noise monitoring in Europe. We thought now a lot of citizens in Europe have a mobile phone. If we can do some calibration of all these mobile phones and people can record for 10 seconds noise level in where they are, let's make it available real time on a website. We thought that it would be more as well rather limited in the response. This was backed up in 2-3 months worldwide, because we didn't restrict it to Europe. Now we have worldwide monitoring of noise across the globe. We do not know yet what to do with this information. But it opens quite a lot of perspective that we seriously need to think about on how we should move on by making use of this technology, but of course not, as maybe not the right word that I would use, abusing the technology as a driver for the direction that we are taking. And finally, I think also a very good example is what we did in 2 publications, Late Lessons from Early Warnings, where there as well we saw that, and especially in the latest report, there is a very interesting chapter as well that clearly shows the importance of lay and local knowledge that is essential, for especially when it comes to early warning, where you need to be very responsive. I have my colleague David Christ, I don't know where he is. David Christ is one of the co-authors of the report, so if you have any questions, he can definitely give you much more detail about this publication, Late Lessons 2, that was in 2013. So to conclude, our conclusion is that we see that citizens are relevant in all the phases of the policy cycle. From identifying the issue, so from before any action is taken, framing it, making sure that we have the right policy measuring identification, having in place a monitoring system that policy measures are implemented, and as well whether they are effective. So that is that is what we put forward as an important message. That is what we will strive for in the coming years to make sure that this will be represented in all steps of this cycle. So to conclude, I would raise 3 statements. First of all, about environmental information. That clearly evolves now from what was initially an authoritative top-down approach to a collaborative contribution and use of this information. Citizen science provides communities with the ability to collect and interpret the data, but the need of experts does not diminish. So it's not that citizens or citizen observation, citizen science will be a replacement for what experts currently contributing to the knowledge base. And there are many levels at which participants can be involved, and different people would and want different levels of engagement. And I think from what I could see from the abstracts that are put forward for this conference, this is probably where also the point of discussion that will be put forward. So I would like to stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. We will take one question.
So thank you very much. I'm Adriana Valente from National Research Council of Italy. And we see that the relationship between research and policy is even difficult. And the general point is, I wonder how much difficult is this from citizen science and policy. I mean, we know that when research results are present in policy decision, and this is not always, of course, it has been studied that generally this use is a particularly symbolic use. So very often research is taken not as instrument for deciding, not as conceptual frame, but as a symbolic use to give strength to already taken decision. And this is a problem that is going to be studied and so on. So I wonder what at the end remains in policy decision of citizen science, also considering the very important point that has been made before related to the participation in deciding research question, in deciding something of the agenda. What at the end remains, can remain of citizen science in decision making? Thank you.
I can understand indeed that we have there an issue, and I think to give an example, if you see what happened with the whole climate change debate, and you could question what is the value of, or what is the value of research for the decision making. The first comment is that we have there indeed, how would I call it, a problem or an issue where decision makers nowadays very often think very much short term, and where research very often is based on long-term objectives, and that's indeed where we are struggling to find the right balance. I could see this as an opportunity to for the citizens when it comes to decision maker, to the politicians. They probably will have more ears to what the public is saying. I would say today, that is sometimes what comes out of research. Of course, it's not that black and white. But I would not, personally, I would not underestimate the power that the public can have for decision making. We should be careful making the link there to how research is currently perceived as the tool for the evidence base for decision making. So I don't know if you see the point that I'm trying to make. We have there indeed, if we then try to link research with citizen science, we need to handle that very carefully. It's also reflected in where citizen science, for instance, has successes, is where you need to have quick responses, where you need, where currently there is no other means than getting it through the voice of the public. And that, I think, is something that we have to clearly evaluate, how we can take that further into the decision-making process.
Thank you. Sorry, we move on.
So, last in the panel, but not least, we'll now hear from Martin, who will tell about the survey that has been done of, well, what participation is actually going on, what citizen participation actually going on in EU research projects. So we'll hear from the field what you have found out there.
Okay, can you hear me? It's okay. I feel a little bit disturbed because we are talking and we don't have the time to ask questions. So I'll try to make my presentation as short as possible. What I'm going to tell you about is part of the results of a European project called Consider. Consider is an interdisciplinary team. Can you progress on?
It should be louder.
Okay. Okay, is it better?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Consider is a European-funded project with an interdisciplinary team, and we are working on CSO's participation into research. And here are today there are some of the part of the team here. I see Tona over there, and there's Simon. And I don't know if somebody else arrived because we expect some more people coming. And the idea is to really be able to look at the practices. So we've been talking about ideas and ideal views and practices in terms of policy. But now I'm going to talk to you about the real implication in actually running a research project. And I'm going to focus on a survey we made of all the FP7 projects and part of them are talking about CSO's participation, but I'll explain that later. So can you progress? So the main focus is coming from the idea that there is a participative imperative, which is not only talking about science and society, it's more about what do we want to do in terms of society as a whole. And this participative imperative is already very strong if we look at politics, if we look at other activity. We also have democratic voices in firms and in businesses as well. So in terms of science and society questions, citizens are asked to take part of research projects in different kind of engagements. We have people that could be a source of knowing the needs, the priorities we would like to give to research teams. There is also the idea that we can foster social acceptability of science. And there are also the idea that citizens can also be end users and subjects of the research project itself. And sometimes researchers themselves think they can represent citizens. And last but not least, sometimes they are used to contribute in a collaborative way. So what we are looking at now is how those different kind of engagement can really end in real practices. And this is what I'm going to show you now. So can you go further? Go more? Okay, this is the global idea of the Consider project. I don't have the time to define it clearly, but we have one big survey, quantitative survey, and then we have case studies with a global approach of that. Okay, so we surveyed all FP7 projects. Can you go on? And this is the names of the people who really worked with me to get the results I'm going to show you today. So there is a very short initial survey of the 14,000 FP7 projects we addressed. We sent the survey to every project coordinators, and it was a very short questionnaire, just to know if they think CSO were included in their projects, and to have an idea of the amount of FP7 projects which could fit with the idea of CSO participation. When we got the answers about those projects, we found out that some of them, a part of them, around 20% of them said, yes, we have CSO participation in our project. And we sent to them another questionnaire, more detailed one, with questions about what they are actually doing, who are the CSOs engaged, and we sent this to the PC, the project coordinators. And when they give us the contact detail, we also send it to the CSO's representative. So we had both views on the project, the view from the project coordinator and the view from the CSO members. So first, who are the people including in the term CSO? CSO is not easy to define, and this is one of the parts of the problem we have to tackle and consider. But the people who actually answer the questionnaire are coming from mainly the public sector and non-for-profit sector, and also they are part of projects. So we try to have projects in every stages, from the start of the project to the project already finished, to have different views on the project. Thank you. So what are the area of research represented here? So you have both surveys here. The first one with the global view on the people who say, yes, we have CSOs including in our project. And the second survey more detailed. So you can see that we lost some of them. So not everybody who answers the first questionnaire saying CSOs are part of our project answer the second one. And you have a different kind of area of research, but in both surveys you can see that, for instance, environmental stakes and businesses stakes are highly represented, and for science and society it's a very small part. So we tried to focus this questionnaire on 3 research questions. I won't detail the 3 of them. I will give you insight on the first one, what are the role of CSOs, and on the last one, what are the expectations. So in our first survey, we found out that when people didn't collaborate with CSOs, it was not because they didn't want to collaborate. It was more because they didn't think they could collaborate with CSOs, and I think it's interesting. It's not only a conscious way of thinking, it's just a positivist view of research. Can you go on? So what are the main role of CSOs in the project? It's interesting to have a few insights. First on who are the CSOs members and who are the researchers implied in the project. Yes, please. So the main interesting result is that, in fact, people working for CSOs and people working for research organization inside FP7 projects are very close in terms of background. They have high scientific background, they have research experience, they are used to talk about research matter. So there is a circulation and a socialization among people working in FP7 projects. So it's not any CSOs who can participate to FP7 projects, and we'll see that, for instance, there are problems about funding that do not allow some kind of CSO to integrate FP7 projects. Yes, please. So that's the proportion of CSOs participating a project from the first survey. So you can see that we have 22% of the respondents who said, yes, we have CSOs included. Can you go on? When we ask what are the roles of CSOs inside the project, no surprise, the first main answers are about dissemination of results and expertise, which is the usual and traditional role of CSOs in research settings. But we also have interesting results in terms of discrepancies between response from program coordinators and answers from CSOs. And you can see that, for instance, CSOs are claiming that they are more usually taking initiatives. So they say we have been initiator of the project. And they also claim that they want to contribute to scientific progress, scientific knowledge. So that's really interesting as well. And in fact, they are also trying to make more than dissemination. So this is a discrepancy that might be interesting to focus on, because project coordinators sometimes are members of CSOs, but it's very, very rare inside of the FP7 project. So I think there is here a difficulty to find a right way of handling research for CSOs. Can you go? So the main interesting fact also is that CSOs are seldomly included from the start of the project, so they have to slot in predetermined format. They are not in the position to discuss the research agenda or the problematic of the research, and that's one part of the problem, because if they don't have a word to say about this agenda setting, they don't. Sometimes they have difficulties to make it well balanced with their own interests inside the research projects. What can we say about expectations? So we have expectations from project coordinators and expectations from CSOs. You can see here that first, project coordinators are always more confident when they talk about the achievements of the objectives of the research project than CSOs are. So that's interesting. I think CSOs are more likely to be critical about the project they are collaborating in. And also they share some expectations. That's really important for the project. They share expectations about policy outcomes, but also about scientific knowledge. And sometimes they also expect to have an influence of the global research findings inside the research project. So to conclude, from the results of this survey, I tried to make a reflection about what kind of patterns do we have in terms of practices of research inside those FP7 projects. So I found out that we could build 4 patterns of participation. Can you go on? This is a way, a figure to show it very easily and very simply, in a simple way. You have the first axis is about scientific leadership. So you can see that some of the projects are CSO driven, and some others are more in a kind of scientific leadership. And we also have the strength of the intensity of collaboration inside the project. So intensity of collaboration, it's more about the working routines and the working habits inside the research team. So we've asked lots of questions about how often do you meet, what are the tools you're using, how do you negotiate conflicts, and so on. And we can, from that point, have ideas of how the collaboration is really able to go on. And for the 4 patterns are when you get low intensity of collaboration, and scientifically it's more about a standard model of CSO participation. When you have high intensity of collaboration and scientific leadership is what I call dialogical model of CSO participation. You have more discussion, dialogue between researchers and CSO members, and you have more impact from the CSO on the research project itself. But still, the scientists are leading the project, and they usually are the ones who decide for methodology and agenda setting. The third one is what I call the functional model of CSO's participation. You have low intensity of collaboration, but you have CSO-driven projects. This is, for instance, projects where you have work packages that are really different and that are autonomous, so people can work in their own ways and they only gather the results. And some people don't even know each other inside the project because it's huge consortium with different kind of teams and so on. And CSOs sometimes themselves, if there are numerous CSOs, don't know each other inside the project. The last model is about co-construction. So it's co-construction model of CSO participation. When you have high intensity of collaboration on CSO-driven projects, this is usually the less numerous part of the practices we've observed during the survey. And this is more close to what we call participatory action research or collaborative inquiry. Okay, so I just want to show you the last slide. Sorry, it's not in it. So you have to come to me. It was just to show you how the project, an overview of how the project dispatched in terms of models of participation. So no surprise, most of the projects are in the standard model or in the dialogical model, but still we have some projects in both other model, functional one and cooperation one. So we now are investigating more deeply with case studies. So we've been involved in the research team. We've been doing observation. We've been doing interviews in different kind of settings, not only FP7 projects. And now we are working on recommendations and guidelines. And we are organizing a World Cafe Thursday afternoon, trying to test some of the first ideas of guidelines and recommendations we have. So we've studied what Ferraris project end up with in terms of guidelines, and we have our own guidelines coming from interviewees and coming from our perception of the problem we can have to tackle when we talk about CSO's participation. So if you want to come in, we are really interested with your views on that topic. Thanks a lot for your attention.
So we can allow for one question. Yeah. And as you heard from Martin, that there will be an opportunity later at the conference to hear more about the Consider project. So,
my name is Victor Friedman. I'm from the Action Research Center for Social Justice in Israel. And actually, my question is to the moderator, but it's inspired by Martin's talk. If I look at what happened in this panel, we're actually going to, I would put it in the far low end of the matrix. In other words, it's been highly led by scientists, and there's no, and even though it's called citizens democracy, and there's actually, to the best of my knowledge, no sort of plain citizens on the panel. So I would ask, no, maybe I'm wrong about that, but everybody is, as I see it. So I wonder, what's the design thinking behind it? What led us not to involve a citizen, so to speak, or someone who's not from the academia or from the administration in the design of this session?
That was because those that we mainly had contact to were within the environmental field, and we didn't want to have the panel too much environmental focus. So therefore, let's have, for example, the presentation from Martin covering more than just the environmental field.
I think it may say something that we need to be self-critical about the way we design our learning in these environments.
Well, I think that there are plenty of opportunities to ask and contribute with your experiences. Any other questions? From citizens or researchers?
And whose voices are heard?
I will continue what Victor has said. I am an activist. I am not an academy. But I am thinking all the time we are discussing CSO problems and what we have already in the society. And I haven't heard what's the role of the academy in this status quo or what we see today in the world? So I don't know that, like this question of who's the citizenship here, who's the citizen? Like there is a citizen and there is the experts. I heard from you, and there is the CSO and there is a researcher. And it seems for me that I don't know, we might maintaining the status quo of what's happening in the society. Is it true? I'm asking.
Is there somebody from the panel that wants to say something?
I can answer part of your questions. I agree. I totally agree that we really need to think about innovative ways of discussing together. I don't think we have to label people telling you are researchers or you are experts or I'm a CSO, I'm an activist. We all have different kind of roles, and we take some roles depending on the context. For instance, here I'm more in my sociologist role than in my activist role, but I'm not reduced to this sociologist role, and I don't think you're reduced to this activist role. So it's interesting also to see how we behave and how we label each other's and how we then discuss together. But the mere difficulty that, for instance, here is how we deal with the space. As we are, I don't know, maybe 300 assisting to this conference, we have less ideas about how we can discuss together when we are 300. Still, we know, each of us know different kinds of settings where we can discuss in a different way. In Consider project, we organize an open forum, which is very different. People gather together and they discuss how they want to organize the day and so on. And so you're sure that everybody is interested by what's going on because they've been engaged in deciding what's the agenda for the day. So there are plenty of solutions. That's more about how we engaged in the discussion. But I don't think living knowledge is a good example of that. I've been in the network for a lot of time, and I think it's one of the places where you can get the most various experiences and the most various design of discussion in a public assembly. So I understand your questions and your remarks, and I was feeling uncomfortable because we had so small amounts of time to discuss together. But still, if you compare with other kind of settings, it's really different here, so don't be too much critical about that.
Okay, so we'll have food now. So at least I hope if somebody haven't spoken up here that they will then speak up in the parallel sessions. We will have the first slots later this afternoon, but right now lunch, and then we'll be back here 1 o'clock, where we will touch upon, let's say, another aspect of involving civil society research, and that is the funding issue. Let's give a hand to the panel.